Hey folks, today we are going to discuss about the cardiac murmurs. As far as cardiac murmurs are concerned in the cardiac medicine, you need to know the position of those cardiac murmurs in the cardiac cycle. You need to know the site where they are heard. Additionally, you should know the intensity of murmur. Well, before I begin with my word, let me clear some of the confusions that you might come across. See, whenever we talk that the cardiac cycle is in diastole or in the diastolic phase, we do mean that the ventricles are in diastole. We are not talking about the atrium, we are talking about the ventricles. Similarly, if we say that the cardiac cycle is in systolic phase, that does mean that the ventricles are in systolic. For example, if I say that I hear a mid-diastolic murmur, that does mean that the murmur is heard in the diastolic phase of the ventricles. That is the diastolic phase of the cardiac cycle. Okay. So before I begin with my detailed word on murmur, let me clear some of the concepts and basics of the cardiac murmurs. Otherwise you'll have to cram all those things, that in which murmur, which type of, in which phase of the cardiac cycle you hear this. Once you imagine the stuff, you will not make a mistake anytime, because you can anytime calculate, you can anytime imagine where the blood flows and you can answer the question. Right? So let us begin with tricuspid stenosis and mitral stenosis murmur. Right? Tricuspid and mitral valve. When do you expect the murmur of mitral stenosis and tricuspid stenosis to occur? What happens in this pathology? There is mitral valve stenosis. There is mitral valve stenosis, or there is tricuspid valve stenosis. So when do you expect an abnormal sound to be coming in this pathology? Whenever fluid passes through a narrowed passage, turbulence would be created. That does mean abnormal sound would be produced. Am I making sense? So here, during the mitral valve stenosis, the blood will flow to the stenosed mitral valve. Right? Now, similarly, in tricuspid stenosis, the blood, that is fluid, will flow through the stenosed tricuspid valve, which will produce turbulence and which will produce abnormal sounds known as murmur. Now the second question is, and that is the most important, when does the blood flow from left atrium to left ventricle? When does the blood flow? During the diastolic phase of left ventricle and right ventricle. So when would you hear the murmurs of tricuspid stenosis and mitral stenosis? Diastolic phase. See, it's very easy. Once you imagine, you can get to know. So if at all you are asked that which murmur do you hear in tricuspid stenosis and mitral stenosis, you can imagine that there is a stenotic lesions between stenotic lesion between atrium and ventricle. So whenever in diastole the blood will flow through the stenosed or the narrowed pathway, that would occur in diastole. There would be abnormal sound produced, which is known as the mitral stenosis murmur. When does the blood flow? During diastolic phase. So you can easily answer that, sir, tricuspid stenosis and mitral stenosis murmur are heard in the diastolic phase. Similarly, let us talk about aortic stenosis and pulmonary stenosis. Aortic stenosis and pulmonary stenosis. The same question you have to ask yourself. In aortic stenosis, there is narrowed pathway, there is narrowed lumen of aorta, right? So when would the murmur of aortic stenosis be produced? Think it yourself. See, whenever the blood will flow from left ventricle to aorta. Similarly, whenever the blood will flow from right ventricle to pulmonary artery, there would be an abnormal sound produced. There would be narrowed pathway which will produce turbulence, which will produce the abnormal sound, which will produce the murmur. Now, the question is this: when does the blood flow from left ventricle to aorta? When does it flow? During the systolic phase. Whenever the left ventricle contracts, blood flows through aorta. Whenever the right ventricle contracts, blood flows to the pulmonary artery. That does mean that aortic stenosis and pulmonary artery stenosis murmur would be heard in the systolic phase. Am I making sense? You can imagine it directly. So if somebody asks you, when do you hear the murmur of aortic stenosis? Which type of murmur do you hear in aortic stenosis? You can easily think that there is stenosis over here. When would be the blood flow from left ventricle to aorta? It would flow in the systolic phase of left ventricle. That does mean it would produce the type of murmur would be systolic murmur, right? Similarly, so we are done with these two murmurs, right? Now, tricuspid regurgitation and mitral regurgitation. Now, think of the condition, right? What does this mean? Mitral and tricuspid regurgitation does mean that the blood is regurgitating abnormally. It is regurgitating. Normally, the blood does not flow from left ventricle to left atrium or from right ventricle to right atrium. There is some pathology in right mitral valve and tricuspid valve, due to which there is some amount of blood that is regurgitating from left ventricle to left atrium. When would the blood be regurgitating from left ventricle to left atrium? Ask yourself the same question. Would it flow in diastole? In diastole, what happens? Blood comes from left atrium to left ventricle. Then when do you expect the blood regurgitates back to left atrium from ventricle to atrium? The blood will regurgitate during the contraction when the pressure in left ventricle increases, and due to the abnormal mitral valve, the blood will regurgitate back, some amount of blood will regurgitate back into left atrium. That's why the regurgitant lesions of mitral valve and tricuspid valve, when do we expect the murmur of it to be coming? The murmur of mitral valve regurgitation and tricuspid regurgitation would occur when there is systole. When there is systole, the pressure will increase, some amount of blood will regurgitate back to left atrium. So you can imagine if somebody asks you, okay, when do you hear the mitral regurgitation and tricuspid regurgitation murmur? You can think, sir, the blood flows or regurgitates back to left atrium or right atrium when the ventricles would be contracting. When does the ventricle contract? The ventricle contracts during the systolic phase of cardiac murmur. So which type of murmur do you get in tricuspid regurgitation and mitral regurgitation? Systolic murmur. Now, one of the last important common murmur is ventricular septal defect. Which type of murmur do you hear in ventricular septal defect? It's very logical, right? The pressure in left side of heart is much higher than the right side of heart. So, the blood will flow from left ventricle to right ventricle. When would you hear the murmur? When the ventricles are in contraction phase. The ventricles are in systolic phase. So, ventricular septal defect murmurs are heard in systolic phase of the cardiac cycle. You get a pansystolic murmur. We are going to discuss in which phase of diastole and systole are these murmurs heard. But this is the concept. This is the basic concept by using which you can directly answer. You can imagine the stuffs and you can directly answer in which part of cardiac cycle do you get all those murmurs. Right? Let us revise it quickly. Right? In tricuspid stenosis and mitral stenosis, there is stenosis over here. So when the blood flows from atrium to ventricle, you will hear a murmur. In which part the blood flows? In diastolic phase. So you get a diastolic murmur in tricuspid stenosis and mitral stenosis. In aortic stenosis and pulmonary artery stenosis, the blood flows to the stenotic area. In which part? During the systolic phase. In the systolic phase, so you get a systolic murmur. In tricuspid regurgitation and mitral regurgitation, blood regurgitates back. The blood regurgitates back during the systolic phase of left ventricle. So you get a systolic murmur in tricuspid regurgitation and mitral regurgitation. And similarly, in ventricular septal defect, it's very logical. When will the blood flow with turbulence? During the left ventricular contraction. And the pressure in left ventricle is much higher than the pressure in the right ventricle. That does mean blood will flow like this. And it will produce the pansystolic murmur. These are the concepts, these are the basics you need to get through, right? Now we are going to discuss about the systolic murmurs in detail, right? We discussed about the basics of systolic and diastolic murmurs, right? So from that we do know that systolic murmurs are seen in the stenotic lesions of aorta and pulmonary artery. Additionally, systolic murmurs are seen in the regurgitant lesions of mitral valve and tricuspid valve. We saw that, right, in the previous section. Ventricles contracted, it is stenosis, fluid or blood passes through the narrowed or stenosed area, producing turbulence, producing murmurs. Similarly, due to regurgitation through the mitral valve and tricuspid valve, we see the systolic murmur in these two conditions. It is systolic stenotic lesions of aortic and pulmonary artery and regurgitant lesions of mitral valve and tricuspid valve. Now, we are going to discuss in detail about the systolic murmur, in which part of systole which cardiac murmur is heard. Right? Forget about the ventricles. Think of a balloon. Right? This is a fluid-filled balloon. This is a fluid-filled balloon. Right? We have made a knot at the bottom using a thread. Right? Now, think of the condition. You are holding the balloon from the top. Right? It is a fluid-filled balloon. Now, if you take a pin and put a pinhole over here. You make a pinhole over here, right? Now, there is a small pinhole being created over here. Fluid, that is water, is not leaking at the moment because you are holding it like this. There is no contraction over here. The balloon is free. So, there is no leaking of fluid, no leaking of water in this balloon. Now, think of the condition. Mark my words. As soon as you squeeze the balloon, what do you expect? Fluid will come out from this end, or as soon as in the very moment when you squeeze the balloon, where do you expect the fluid to come out? Where do you expect the water to come out? Don't you think that the water will come out of this pinhole at the very moment you squeeze? At the very moment, as soon as you squeeze, the water will come out. There will be a stream of water will be coming out through this pinhole before it comes out through this end, before it comes out to this end. So, in early squeezing, as soon as you squeeze in early part, water comes out of this pinhole. Similarly, the same analogy we use over here in ventricles. Let us take an example of mitral regurgitation lesion. We are taking an example of mitral regurgitation lesion. Like, as soon as the ventricle contracts, in the earliest part, at that very moment, as the fluid, similar to this and analogous to this, as the fluid came out of this, regurgitated out of this pinhole. Similarly, as soon as the ventricles contract, the ventricles are completely filled with blood. So as soon as the left ventricle contracts, fluid will regurgitate, blood will regurgitate. That is the reason why mitral regurgitation murmur is seen in the early part of the systole. As soon as the ventricle contracts, in the earliest part of systole, as the fluid came out of here through pinhole, similarly, analogous to that, as soon as you squeeze the balloon, as soon as you undergo the contraction of left ventricle, there would be regurgitation of blood. So, there is early systolic murmur heard in mitral regurgitation. If somebody asks you, which type of murmur do you hear in mitral regurgitation? You can think, when does the blood regurgitate? In systole. So, the first and foremost thing is systolic murmur. Secondly, in which part of systole? You can remember this balloon analogy. You can remember this, that it flows out, it regurgitates in the earliest part of systole. Am I making sense? Now, so in early systolic murmur is seen in mitral regurgitation. Now, in aortic stenosis and pulmonary artery stenosis, during the middle part of the systole, during mid part of systole, large amount of blood with high pressure flows through the stenosed areas. Producing turbulence, producing murmur. So, that is the reason why in aortic stenosis and pulmonary stenosis, you hear a mid-systolic murmur. Because in mid-systole, large amount of blood with high pressure flows through the stenosed area. Similarly, you hear the late systolic murmur in mitral valve prolapse. Mitral valve prolapse is a type of degeneration of mitral valve. It is a myxomatous type of degeneration, right? In which you hear late systolic murmur. Am I making sense? So in early systolic murmur, fluid, blood regurgitates in earliest part of the systole. In mid systolic, large amount of blood flows with high pressure through the stenosis area of aorta and pulmonary artery. Right? Clear? So you hear a mid systolic murmur in aortic stenosis and pulmonary stenosis, and late systolic murmur in mitral valve prolapse. Now, ventricular septal defect. As you all know, in ventricular septal defect, there is high pressure in left ventricle, relatively less pressure in right ventricle. So, throughout the systole, due to high pressure difference between left ventricle and right ventricle, blood will be flowing from left ventricle through right ventricle with high pressure, with high velocity, producing turbulence, producing pansystolic murmur throughout the systole. Not early, not mid, not late. Throughout the systole, you hear a systolic murmur of ventricular septal defect, because there is high pressure difference between the two, left ventricle and the right ventricle. Blood will flow from left ventricle to right ventricle, producing pansystolic murmur. So these were the systolic murmurs in details. I repeat, systolic murmurs are heard in the stenotic lesions, of aorta and pulmonary artery, and in the regurgitant lesions of mitral valve and tricuspid valve. As you all know, these two things are much important to remember, right? These were the systolic murmurs. Okay, now we are going to discuss about the diastolic murmurs, right? As you all know, diastolic murmurs are heard in the stenotic lesions of mitral valve and tricuspid valve. When does the blood come in ventricles? During the diastolic phase. When does the blood flow through the stenosis lesion? In mitral and tricuspid valve stenosis. Right? So diastolic murmurs are heard in the stenotic lesions of mitral valve and tricuspid valve. Additionally, they are heard in the regurgitant lesions of aorta. Diastolic murmurs are heard. Murmurs which are heard during the diastole could be due to the stenotic lesions of mitral valve and tricuspid valve, or it could be due to the regurgitant lesions of aorta. Am I making sense? So these are the two types of diastolic murmurs, right? Now let us discuss in detail in which part of the diastole which murmur is heard. See, in the earliest part of the diastole, you hear the aortic regurgitant murmur, right? The blood regurgitates back to left ventricle from aorta during the earliest part of the diastole. In the instantaneous part, in the earliest part, when the ventricle going in diastole, at that moment you hear the aortic regurgitation murmur. Now, during the mid diastole, when large amount of blood through high pressure flows through the stenosed area of mitral valve or tricuspid valve, there is turbulence which produces the abnormal sounds here, which produces the murmurs of mitral stenosis and tricuspid stenosis. Therefore, we say that we hear mid diastolic murmur in mitral stenosis and tricuspid stenosis, because in the middle part of diastole, large amount of blood with high pressure flows through the stenosed area of mitral and tricuspid valve. And in the late part of diastole, you can hear mitral stenosis murmur that is being continued. So these are three phases of diastolic murmur. If you hear the murmur in early diastolic phase, you can suspect it to be a aortic regurgitant murmur. If you hear in the mid diastolic phase, you can suspect it to be mitral stenosis or tricuspid stenosis murmur. And similarly, in the late part of diastolic murmur, there could be a mitral stenosis murmur. Right? Now, what are continuous murmur? Continuous murmur are the types of murmur which starts during the systolic phase and they continue to go in the diastolic phase. Right? They start in the systolic phase, they continue to go in the diastolic phase, They peak during the second heart sound. During the second heart sound, they peak. So they are continuous throughout the cardiac cycle, starting from systole and goes into the diastole. Hence, they are known as continuous murmur. Where are they seen? They are seen in patent ductus arteriosus, aortopulmonary shunt, arteriovenous fistula. You can hear it in venous hum. You can hear it in collaterals. These are the places, these are the pathologies where you see the continuous murmur. As we discussed, diastolic murmur are seen in the stenotic lesions of mitral and tricuspid valve and regurgitant lesions of aorta. Okay, so finally we are going to discuss about the location at which we hear the murmurs and some of the miscellaneous topics, miscellaneous points, right? In second, this is the left sternal border. I have drawn this schematic diagram for you to remember things easily. This is the left sternal border, right sternal border, right? In second intercostal space, there is pulmonary valve. So pulmonary stenosis murmur is heard best in the left sternal border at second intercostal space. Similarly, in the right sternal border, at right sternal border, on the second intercostal space, you hear the aortic stenosis murmur. Aortic valve is located, so you hear the aortic stenosis murmur. Now, in third intercostal space, the location, the left sternal border, that area is known as Erb's area. And it is the classical location, it is the classical site where aortic regurgitation murmur is heard. This is very important. Aortic regurgitation murmurs are located in the Erb's area, which is located in the left sternal border at third intercostal space. Right? So second intercostal space, pulmonary valve, aortic valve. Third intercostal space, Erb's area, aortic regurgitation murmur is heard. In fourth intercostal space, tricuspid valve murmur is heard. Fourth intercostal space, left sternal border, tricuspid valve murmur is heard. And last but not the least, in fifth intercostal space, in the mid-clavicular line, you hear the mitral valve murmur. Any mitral valve murmur would be heard in the mid-clavicular line at fifth intercostal space. Now some of the miscellaneous points, right? See, aortic stenosis murmur, it is diamond shaped murmur. As you all know, it is systolic murmur. Aortic stenosis, the first thing that should come to your mind is, it is a systolic murmur. And it is a diamond shaped murmur, right? Now, aortic regurgitation, there is a classical characteristic decrescendo pattern of diastolic murmur. As you all know, aortic regurgitation does mean diastolic murmur, right? It is heard classically at the Erb's area. Where the Erb's area is located? In the third intercostal space, left sternal border. Am I making sense? See, decrescendo pattern is a specific characteristic pattern of aortic regurgitation. Additionally, we had a word that in mitral regurgitation there is early systolic murmur which is heard. Now, in chronic mitral regurgitation and tricuspid regurgitation, you can hear pansystolic murmur as well, right? Now, if we discuss about the pitch, in mitral stenosis, you hear a low pitch murmur. In aortic regurgitation, you hear a high pitch murmur. And in aortic stenosis and mitral regurgitation, you hear a mixed frequency murmur, right? In mitral stenosis, you hear a low pitch murmur. In aortic regurgitation, in mitral stenosis, you hear a low pitch murmur. In aortic regurgitation, you hear a high pitch murmur. And in aortic stenosis and mitral regurgitation, you hear a mixed frequency murmur. That was all about murmurs, cardiac murmurs in cardiac medicine. It was an effort to simplify murmurs for you. I hope you guys enjoyed and understood the core mechanism and concepts of murmur. Hope you guys liked it. Thank you for watching the video.